against Alex Wayne, say there is no possibility of the world state, and therefore there is no possibility of universal international order. So
Mhm.
to call an order global, it's really more about geography. But to
Mhm.
call it a universal is really about its moral implications. So I would argue, at least in our lifetime, we are not going to see a universal global order. There's not a possibility. So there's no possibility of the world state, as Alex Wynn would want to put it. But we are actually living in a partially globalized order.
Mhm.
But now this order, I think, has fractured into a few blocks. Right?
Mhm.
Maybe the North Atlantic bloc remains one, but then the non-Western part of the Earth, it's not one single block, right? So you can have, let's say, in Middle East, in South Asia, or in East Asia, there may be a few blocks. But by blocks, I don't really mean alliance per se, but I mean a few countries submit or at least agree to a core set of principles, and therefore we can call it a bloc.
Mhm.
But that kind of particular bloc is not universal in
Mhm.
any meaningful sense. So we are not going to see a universal global order, and we are not going to witness a truly meaningful global order. Right? Let me stop here.
Okay. Okay. Uh, Professor Acharya?
Right. So yeah, that's pretty much would be also my view. And what Professor Tang said, I just want to elaborate slightly. So Henry Kissinger, whose book World Order you cited, is a classic example of what is wrong in our understanding of global order or world
Mhm.
order. I actually use it as a teaching tool. I use it as a textbook to tell where it is he gets the world order wrong. He gets
Mhm.
world order right in one thing. That's what Professor Tang pointed out. I agree. So Kissinger, Tang Siping, Acharya all agree on one thing. There is no truly universal order. He actually says that. I mean, Kissinger said that
Mhm.
there no truly global order ever existed. So he defines world order, which I interchangeably use with global order, as a concept held by a civilization or region about certain ideas and distribution of power that
Mhm.
that civilization thinks as universally applicable. It
Mhm.
doesn't make it as global. In my other work, End of American World Order, you have already pointed out, Professor
Mhm.
Ushong has pointed out, that, and I said liberal order was never truly global. It was
Mhm.
a club of the West. It
Mhm.
was basically a privileged club that you have to now pay into uh, by membership, either through money or through difference. To be a member, and you are never treated in the same way. China and India, the largest countries in the world, were never part of the liberal order, except much later in the 90s and in a very superficial sense when they have to buy in membership by adjusting their policies. They were never present at the creation. So we agree
Mhm.
on that point. But look at Kissinger's book. It
Mhm.
is the blatant way of Eurocentrism. His first two chapters are about Europe. So Westphalian, chapter, I think 1 or 2, and then Concept of Europe, number 2. So the first two chapters starts world order with European chapters. Then he goes back in history, brings in Islam, brings in India, brings in China, and then you know, uh, considering them, the chapter on Islam is actually called a world in disorder, not in order. So Islam never produced an order but disorder. Then he comes back to the United States as the savior of the world. Now that's how knowledge about world order had been perpetuated. I invite you to go back and take a look at his book.
Mhm.
Uh, so that means Europe is the model. World order started in Westphalia and the concept, and countries which are actually older civilizations, like
Mhm.
China, like India, like the Islamic world order, much predated Westphalia. They are afterthoughts. They deserve not a place in the bottom, beginning, but in the middle. And America sort of explains it all, brings it all together. Now, I'm working on a book myself, which is actually finished, now looking for a publisher. It's called A History of World Order, or A New History of World Order. Precisely the opposite. World order started with, really, you can find Egyptians and Sumerians. The concept of divine monarchy, which still exists today, the idea of republic, which is the foundation of modern world order, actually originated there. And then it went through Persia, China, India, Africa. So all these regions are covered in my narrative. The basic point I'm trying to make is that world order or global order, I'm using them interchangeably, doesn't have a single point of origin. It has multiple points of origin. It has multiple global origin. Some of these ideas and institutions, whether it's republic, whether it's sovereignty, whether it is law of the sea, whether it is international diplomacy and cooperation, originated from multiple points. Sometimes independently, sometimes through diffusion. So maybe actually the Egyptians and the Sumerians, invented divine monarchy. The most successful, durable domestic political institution in the history of humanity is divine monarchy, not democracy, not republic, divine monarchy, which we still have monarchies, but not so much. But until 19th century, the world had more monarchies than other forms of institutions. They were independently invented in Sumer and Egypt, neighboring civilizations. Now, you can talk about technology. I'm talking about cotton. Cotton is a resource, was independently invented in Peru and India, cultivated for the first time. They have never had an interaction that we know of. So independent invention is one. The other one is diffusion. So you can have ideas coming from one place and diffuse to others. We have many examples of that, whether it's philosophy or mathematics or the Chinese inventions like paper, gunpowder, they diffuse. And ideas also diffuse. Ideas of, say, free market, diffuse. Ideas, humanitarian law, diffuse. Civilizations learn from each other. So Eastern civilizations learn from the West, but Western civilizations also learned a lot from the rest, especially from East. So if you accept that world order has multiple global origins, things become clearer to you that it is, of course, a bit confusing, but you can find very precise ways of how ideas travel and how ideas spread, and ideas are independently invented. But some commonality comes up in the end. And this is because we are all human beings. I mean, despite differences in culture, civilization, geography, which we acknowledge, there is a human dimension to all of IR, which we often neglect. That human beings tend to invent similar things to survive, to preserve themselves, to advance. And whether you talk about fire, and it's pretty hard to say where fire was invented in one place, or the idea of self-preservation, the idea of cooperation. These are not culturally specific norms. So because we are human beings, and there is evidence of diffusion, by the way. I mean, the Indo-European group of languages, for example, similarities between Sanskrit in India and say French or Latin in Europe. Population, well, migration of early human beings from Africa. So if we accept those things, more or less, why don't we accept that ideas of international relations also originated sometimes in one place, but diffused all over, sometimes independently invented. And now because of globalization, we are becoming more aware of it, or sometimes countries directly influence each other. So that's how I understand world order and global order. Finally, what about the future? Russia, Ukraine. The future will be multi-civilizational. It will be just as it has always been, that different civilizations and different regions will contribute their ideas of world order. It will be more regionally evident. There will be regional dimensions to it. The Western dominance, which was never a singular world order, as we said earlier, is going to even dissipate further because of the decline of the West, both materially and ideational decline, and the reassertion of more other civilizations. So Russia and Ukraine war is going to hasten it. The West has become West, more the assertion of Western identity, and they think they're having a good time right now because of the condemnation of Russian invasion. But as I've argued recently in some of my essays, the global South does disagree and even condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine because it's a violation of a principle that most global South countries, including China, adhere to. But that doesn't mean they accept the Western world order. So criticizing Russia, condemning Russia, is not incompatible with rejecting the current Western-dominated world order. They are not incompatible. So as Western scholars and policymakers say, either you're with us or against us. No, most countries of global South are actually for themselves. And they can criticize Russia. They can also criticize the West at the same time where the principles are being violated. That means that we are not going to live under the same world order that is imposed by the United States, no matter how coercive American policies are, which are extremely coercive now when it comes to like if now you can have secondary sanctions, you get criticized, and more may be coming, but that is not going to be acceptable to vast majority of countries in the world. And that's why the world order will become more diffuse, what I call more multiplex.
Okay, great. Well, I think as we have received quite a lot of the the questions from this audience. I think that's let me actually read through some of them. I think it's where, as you were talking about this global IR, and there's one question is saying that how do one ensure that global IR incorporates a diverse source of its theory, since much research is either in English or behind language and culture barriers. So, or is published in local language in research in respective countries. Do you think there's a risk that IR theory fractions into regional distinctions, as was described? There exist language barriers among other obstacles such as culture and the distance. So yes, I think that we're also facing this sort of like the risk of this collapse of the or reversal of the globalization, or back to this regionalization. So can we actually see there's no such global IR, but just regional IR? Would that be a possibility?
Yeah. So Professor Tang probably can start with that.
Okay.
Okay. Let me jump in. I actually noticed that this particular question I think is excellent. Which is actually connected to what I actually have said about, let's say, we have a Pan-Asia IR journal. So I would argue that it is possible and actually even positive to have a regional IR community and also a regional IR journal. And therefore, we may actually have, or we may desire, a kind of a regional or more regionalized IR ventures. In the sense, it is not incompatible with global IR, because global IR itself embraces locality, regionality, and also regional kind of socialization and institutionalization. So I would argue that it's actually positive. Now, there is one drawback, which I would readily concur and actually mention as it, in the sense we need to have important contributions from other regions published in English, because most of us have English as a second language, and we don't have the time, including myself, to study another language and master it sufficiently in order to be able to read, let's say, Russian, or Hindi, or Portuguese. And therefore, that's one of the things why I actually encouraged like International Studies Quarterly, International Studies Review, or now Security Studies, which actually I think, as far as I know, is the first journal in IR to actually implement a policy to kind of mentor or guide a submission from the Global South, as long as it contains very interesting idea and knowledge, even though its English may not be good enough. So I actually emphasize it's very important for the Western IR community to realize that not everybody can write sufficiently good English in order to qualify to be able to go through the review process. If you write in bad English, you will mostly get a desk rejection. So we actually have to avoid that. But that takes commitment from, let's say, regional IR community, but also, let's say, more established scholars like Amitabh and perhaps myself. So I actually volunteered to be a possible mentor, let's say, from maybe China, maybe Brazil, maybe India, as long as I think the piece under review is very interesting and present very fresh, refreshing ideas. So I think language barrier is something we must admit and recognize, but that's not the most critical barrier in order for us to advance global IR. Because if you write in English and submit to, let's say, CGIP, which I also has long advocated, say, you guys should really publish more submissions from Global South, even though it may not be written in excellent English. So once journals, once regional organizations can actually set up a certain kind of mechanism for guiding and mentoring, publishing in English journals, I would say that barrier is there, but it can be partially overcome, right? Thank you.
Okay, great. Professor Acharya.
So yeah, a barrier is still there. It can be only partially overcome, at least in the short term. But let me also add that what is the alternative? You want to keep doing the same thing, like applying English language produced Western theory, which is overwhelmingly written by white and even male scholars from European or US backgrounds, or scholars who are actually, like myself, for example, who are originally from Global South. I studied to my master's degree in India, so the foundation was in India very much. And I've spent half of my life in non-West as a West, but I still write in English. And I do use Western theory. I don't reject constructivism per se, although I disagree with it. So anyway, the point is, what is the alternative? So the alternative is to stay within the same paradigm, same exclusions, same dominance of a particular culture, civilization, or try to break out of it in whatever small way. Global IR, as I've said before, is going to be not through a big bang, but through 1,000 small steps. As Chairman Mao would say, that let 1,000 flowers bloom. And that's pretty much what is happening. I am not worried by it, partly because what was happening is better than what was there before. And secondly, we can also find that there are certain changes happening, and more people are being conscious that there is a movement out there, and these are Western scholars. They're becoming more aware, more conscious that it cannot be business as usual. The Americans are the least prone to do this. I'm talking about the white Americans, to be very blunt. White male Americans are least resistant to, are least conscious of opening up IR. But there are a lot of professors in the US who are from Asian, Black origin, people like myself, who are American, Canadian, but they don't buy the male-dominated white American IR theory. There's a lot of discourse going on around that. Or in Europe, it's the British who are the least resistant, very American in that way. They have their English school, and I empathize with. I work with Barry Buzan. But I also think the British in general are not very welcoming of non-Western perspectives. Again, a certain section of British society. But when you come to France, there was a question about France in the Q&A. They are. France is a very global IR oriented these days. I just had discussions with Frederick Ramel of Sciences Po, and they're hiring people who does global IR. In fact, I was part of a committee to hire a professor. The Germans are actually much more sensitive. So the continental Europeans are a little different from, say, the United States or Europe, but even within the West, and this is important, even within the so-called West, there is a huge division between certain identities who are the privileged established IR, the people who, for example, dominate international organization. But International Studies Quarterly is changing in terms of accepting international studies review, and new journals are coming up, books are coming up. So where they publish in English, but they try to also bring in more people from the global south to actually like International Affairs Journal in Britain now has a policy of having certain number of women and non-Western, non-white racial minorities as authors. Okay, so that's pretty much what I'll say. We have to have patience. It's not going to change overnight. The dominance of the English language is a fact of life, but we should not have to accept it by constantly questioning it and changing the syllabi. This is why I really have a Professor Tang's earlier point that when you do a syllabus for IR or any social sciences, try to bring in as much as you can from non-Western scholarship and create the awareness that there is a world of IR out there, even if it is expressed in the same language. Sometimes it can be translated. The Chinese do an exceptionally good job of translating books from, and I've 5 books into Chinese now, and do more and more of the translation of non-Western scholars, which is growing, even though they're written in English, but they express the facts and experiences of non-Western scholarship.
Okay, we have the next question. I think is we have many, but let me actually find this one. I think this is quite interesting. So because I think is both of you actually mentioned about this Chinese, some of the Chinese philosopher like Zhao Tingyang, who actually having advocated the idea of the Tianxia, right? So the Tianxia also advocate that the same inclusiveness as that of the global IR. Is Tianxia really useless? Or I think it's the question for Professor Tang, or toxical as an approach? If that will be why throw the baby away with the bathwater, could you please clarify any theoretical merits of the Tianxia? Is there any?
Let me try to be fairly brief, right? So I have never been a fan of Tianxia because I think its original exposition by Zhao Tingyang was fairly China-centric. So I'm not really disputing the possibility that Tianxia has potential universal implications because by definition, Tianxia has a kind of a universal claim. But it does not really mean what he has been able to say really has a universal charm or claim, right? As far as I can tell, I don't think his original idea was to truly advance a potentially universal kind of value system that will be able to bring practical IR into discussion. The reason I think, which at least in my opinion, is actually while he was able to really kind of draw inspiration from traditional Chinese political thought, he was not really adequately knowledgeable about Western IR, but even let's say non-Western IR by Armitov. So that's what I said. In order to engage or to advance global IR, you need to understand the mainstream quote unquote Western IR first. You actually have some knowledge about it. What Zhao Tingyang was able to do was mostly to kind of draw, let's say, roadmap without really getting in touch with Western IR. So if you really want to advance Tianxia as an IR kind of a concept, then perhaps, Professor Qin Yaqing's kind of attempt will be more successful in the sense because he knew, IR theory from the West and also non-West much better. So that's what I want to kind of briefly reply. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually also something to quickly add. I actually have quite a number of dealings with Professor Zhao Tingyang. In 2017, we actually took a train together from Beijing to Qingdao to attend a conference that Professor Daniel Bell organized. And we're sitting next to each other, and there was no fast train those days, at least between Beijing and part of the road was a slow train. So we had 4 hours together, and I did engage him about his Tianxia concept. And his first comment was that I am not an IR scholar. So I'm a philosopher, and I've been talking to IR scholars, and including, of course, Professor Qin Yaqin, who is a very dear friend of mine, and so I'm developing this. So that shows. But having said that, the reason why I personally have some empathy for Professor Zhao's work is firstly because it conforms to the idea that the world order is not global. It comes out of a cultural, regional, even national setting. So when John Fairbank talked about the Chinese world order, it was not world order, it's basically the tributary system. It's China and East Asia, not even so much Southeast Asia, if you really want to critique it. So the Indians talk about their world order, universalism. Every civilization considers itself as universal. So Tianxia brought that out, and also thereby exposed Chinese ethnocentrism to critique, but also said that every civilization has its own idea of world order. What it thinks is right. It may not be others, but it thinks is right for China, but also for the rest of the world. So in that sense, I am kind of a little more sympathetic to this idea that the fact that it's on the table for us to critique and discuss, but not necessarily to accept. And that's what has been happening. It has created an amount of debate, just like Professor Yan's moral realism or Qin Yaqin's relational theory. I said they're all welcome part of global IR in my article, From Heaven to Earth. So my article was titled From Heaven to Earth. This theory started in heaven, Tianxia, all under heaven, and they become, kind of brought down to earth by these scholars. There are a lot of limitations, which I point out, a lot of things to be done, but they are useful for us to think. The way to make them more useful is to make sure that if they have to be really useful, durable, they should be able to travel. They should be able to be accepted and critiqued outside of China or East Asia. And secondly, they should not be the prerogative of 1 or 2 scholars, like whether it is a Beijing school, a Chinese school, or Tsinghua school. In that sense, they should have adherents, both inside and outside China, multiple adherents. They should inform and guide research. Maybe, by that I mean they should be subjected to criticism, but also framing for writing new books and dissertations. If they don't pass the test, they are not really IR theories.
Well, that's, I think that was kind of like also some of the other questions are related. Also talking about, can we actually have a universal theory? I think it's Professor Acharya's point that, if you are actually, if there's any schools of the theories, a way you have to see whether the theory can be really universal or, global, that it can travel beyond this kind of a national or regional context from which it's derived from for the first place. So I think there's many of this, I think some questions will also relate to that. Let me actually read one more. This is actually also a question from our own, one of our, participants of this conference. And for Western IR or social science theories, the tension between the public order and individual autonomy seems to be one of the core questions which build up the foundation of the Western knowledge system. As a research agenda, is there any core question to guide the future studies as the efforts to build up a more inclusive knowledge system? So I think this is sort of like a term, the knowledge system, which has become quite, discussed a lot I think is in this Chinese context, as we were thinking about build up this sort of like a Chinese knowledge system. So this is actually something we're actually being discussed this morning, and as part of this kind of like the way we're the theme of today's conference. So this question is moved beyond the IR, but talking about the core value of this kind of like a state and the public versus the private or individual autonomy. So do you think this is sort of like one of the core differences between the West and non-Western, or the rest of the world?
I think.
Well, Professor Tang?
I'm not really sure that I heard the question entirely clear, but I think it was a question by Xingrui Rui,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
for
Yes,
Western
yeah.
IR or social theories, social science theories, tension between public order and individual autonomy, subjective seems to be one of the core questions which build up the foundation of Western knowledge system. As a research agenda, is there any core question to guide the future studies as an effort to build up a more inclusive knowledge system? So it is highly intellectual, philosophical, in the sense it's really about sociology of knowledge. I'm not really sure that what he really wants to get into, but as my kind of a personal take, I would say scholarship is always mostly an individual adventure within a particular public order, right? So by exercising intellectual curiosity and endeavor, you are actually asserting your individual autonomy. So if you do not really want to, let's say, get sucked into the purely public discourse, and you want to contribute to human knowledge, you are already asserting your individual autonomy, which I think both Amitav and I have been able to do. In the sense, say, Amitav could easily become a mainstream constructivist, which he chose not to. And I choose to kind of depart from, let's say, a more foreign policy oriented Chinese IR stuff into a more theoretical kind of orientation, even though I would say purely theoretical exercise do not really get much, at least reward in the Chinese educational system. So if you write about Chinese foreign policy, you may become very famous. But if you write for IR theory, you have a very small audience. So, and I would argue within a particular public order, individual autonomy by scholarship or by scholars is actually quite easy to achieve. And I do not really think that's different in the West or in the East. It's like a Confucian or Mencius, they were actually asserting the intellectual autonomy, even though they want to advance certain ideas about, let's say, Confucian order. I'm tough.
Right. So what the way I look at it, this idea of a public order versus individual autonomy is not an either-or situation, and you need a bit of both to make a society stable. Let me transpose these categories to international relations. So public order to me translates to world order. Individual autonomy translates to, say, national autonomy or sovereignty. Now, you can't have one without the other. In a world of individual autonomy, a nation's national sovereignty, you are going to have chaos if that's what you focus on. So you need to have some ordering mechanism. But if you only emphasize public order at the expense of sovereignty or autonomy, you will become, in the worst case, a dictatorship, an imperial hegemony, a little bit like the United States trying to do after World War II, or you become like European Union, where everybody has to standardize everything in the same way, and you just override the nation state, which leads to countries like Britain leaving the European Union. So you need a bit of both, and they can be reconciled. You cannot have this end of history, one civilization, one standard, the kind of universalism of people like the European Enlightenment. I would like to take a couple of minutes to address some of the other questions I found in the chat box, in the Q&A box, which relate to this point. One is, of course, about this idea. One question was about plural universalism. Is it a paradoxical term? Yes, it is paradoxical, but no more, probably less so than the other form of universalism, when the European Enlightenment universalism says we are universal, but we are particular. So because you have to adhere to our standard. That's more paradoxical because that's like imposing a set of values on every civilization. It's like the idea of human rights. I'm a big supporter of human rights, but I also believe human rights has multiple origins, and I can prove it through in my book that how different civilizations develop different concepts of human rights. They are different from the contemporary concept of human rights, but so are the Magna Carta. The original concept that West thinks that is where human rights started was actually basically property rights issued with a sword and the neck of King John, that you do this or else. Basically, elites challenging elites to maintain their property rights. And we call it as the foundation of human rights today. But there are many other areas where human rights came, which are people-centric, from both India and China, which you have to also accept. In the same vein, pluralistic universalism sounds kind of self-contradictory, but it is much less so than the idea that one set of ideas applies to all. And human rights, the idea of human rights that were invented in Europe in the 19th century, not earlier, is actually applicable to all, although no other civilization had anything to do with creating it. Now, moving on to one other question is whether global IR or globalizing IR, are we, by doing global IR, basically replicating and expanding Western IR? This issue is very interesting because it came up, as Professor Tang mentioned, we have a new section called Global IR section. The original title for this was Globalizing IR. It may interest you to know. That was the first petition we submitted, which didn't get to be discussed. It didn't have enough signatures, or there was a mistake made by the organizers. It was called Globalizing IR. So the second year when we resubmitted the petition, actually we changed it to Global IR. Precisely because we didn't want to give the impression that it is globalizing what is out there. Far from it. Global IR is actually about resisting, challenging existing IR theories, which are Western dominated, without necessarily saying, rebooting the discipline and saying you disappear. Because for two reasons. One is that IR theory, even mainstream IR theories, are not homogeneous. So I am a constructivist, so is Alexander Wendt. Professor Tang is a realist, but so is Kenneth Walsh. But they are not same. So there are internal diversity within theories. And this is also theory change. IR theories in the 60s and 70s are not what it used to be today. Constructivism didn't exist in the 70s and 60s. So we should not be ignorant of that. And secondly, there are many people, including China, who are not necessarily post-colonial, post-Western, non-Western. They do existing theories. We have to respect that. A lot of Indians are either post-colonial or realist. There's no in between. In China, I have written in my 2019 article that not everybody does Chinese school IR. I actually cited Professor Tang Xiping as an example who doesn't buy into the Chinese school of IR. But that's healthy. And therefore, it's not globalizing. Global IR is not globalizing IR. We have rejected globalizing IR for precisely the same reason. And we have also openly called for diversity, including things that are based on critiques of the West, but including things that are nothing to do with the West. A completely different view of ontology, completely different view of epistemology. And finally, there is a point about what incentives Chinese scholars have to incorporate and learn from Western history. There was a question, and I hope I got it right. Because IR theory is from the West, so why should Chinese scholars, read Western history? Precisely for the reason Professor Tang also mentioned, that we should be aware that there are civilizations and countries that have a very obsession with certain concepts and ideas. And if you reject it, you can reject it, but not understanding them means you are actually shortchanging yourself, that you cannot really do a proper critique. So it is very important for us to do history, including Western history, but not limit ourselves to that history. There's plenty of interesting history, or Western or even Chinese or Indian history. So in my forthcoming book, The New History of World Order, I bring in every single civilization, not because I'm trying to be inclusive, but I actually find that a lot of elements of what we call the modern world order has actually multiple origins from many different parts of the world. We need to be aware of it. It takes a long time. There's no one textbook that does it, but which is one of the reasons why I thought I'll write this or attempt to write this. But there are lessons to be learned from every civilization about different aspects of world order that either come together because we're more aware of each other, or because we were simply excluding them because we're racist and ethnocentric. What Africans did doesn't matter. What pre-Columbian American, the Incas and Mayas and Aztecs did, it's not relevant. Well, we had a little bit of awareness of China and India, a little bit of awareness of Islam, but we completely marginalized, excluded Africa and the pre-Columbian civilizations, Native American Indians. But I actually find that they had a lot of interesting things to say and way of understanding world order. There are parallels, there are similarities, independently constructed, sometimes a diffusion, and that's not surprising because, as I said, international relations is ultimately done by human beings, and there are some common foundations to us as human beings.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. I think as we have still have some questions, but I think we're actually getting close to the end of our event. I think this is a great event, having both of this, we have two very distinguished, speakers who actually speak on this, global IR. So, and also their implications, and also what's the future agenda. So I think it's, let me actually close by actually echo this what Professor Tang and Professor Acharya was, and actually advocate that this is a research agenda. This is also a movement that we should actually really try to move that beyond this just as a sort of like a being one theory, which actually make it be move beyond this sort of like a Western centric, but in the same time also want to move beyond avoid any single civilization centric, a global IR. And also I think it's to make it truly inclusive. You have to be critical. You have to be make it constructive and also have insightful. This common this the knowledge. And so I think in that way we can actually really build this sort of like a so-called as knowledge system that which we can really having create this some like a new knowledge which can move beyond a national border or the regional context. So I think it's this is actually a great presentations for both of you. So I think as we were all gonna I think as I learned a lot from this your presentation. I believe I hope our audience can also have learned from this this conversation. So unfortunately we don't have enough time to actually having address all this the different issues and questions, but we do hope we can keep this kind of like a conversation or dialogue frequently in the future, so we would have once we have this kind of like a travel restriction ban travel restriction lifted, so we would really like to invite and Professor Acharya to come to Fudan actually to be here to actually give a many talks and in the future. So so I would like to again thank both Professor Acharya and Professor Tang for your excellent presentations and answers, and also I thank all the audience and also their staff who actually students volunteers to help on this setup, make this event possible. So I think we are let me just say we conclude this talk today. So and good night, and thank you all very much.
So Professor Chen, would you like to take a picture together?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So we should. Can we actually all turn on the camera so we could actually have a group photo? So this is sort of like become a new normal. So we do this. Yes, and我们一起这个叶子拍照的时候跟我们说一下
Okay.
啊。
I'll do it. Okay.
好，大家来。
So just the pictures
Okay,
now.
thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you
for
so much,
inviting me.
Amstaff.
Okay.
And
Okay.
hope to see you
See you.
again, and hopefully we'll be able
See you.
to
Bye.
see each
I
other
hope so
Bye.
too.
in the real
Yeah.
world
I
rather
hope
than
so.
We're
online.
gonna meet you
In
physically
person,
right
yeah.
now here. Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Bye
Okay.
bye.
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 好，谢谢大家，
Bye.
好，谢谢大家，我们今天
拜拜
结束啊。
But
这个
just to tell
Bye-bye.
ask the government to change the zero COVID policy. We'll all be there.
yeah, we hope
We
it
hope.
one can happen soon.
All right.
right?
Okay. Bye bye.
Okay.
对，
Bye bye.
Bye.
好，
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
谢谢佳杰
Thank
，Thank
you.
you。OK， 好的，好的，谢谢，好，很好，这个
这里结束。
出了。
老师，我这里结束录制了，
好的，那我们就结束了，
然后我结束会议。
结束会议。